Behind me is the military cemetery and ossuary at Verdun in north central France, the scene of a 10-month battle between the French and the Germans in 1916, in which an estimated 700,000 French and German soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in action. And of these, about 306,000 were killed. The cemetery behind me contains the remains of about 16,000 French dead. And these were soldiers whose bodies were sufficiently intact that they could be buried individually. You couldn't always identify them, but they were at least bodies that you could tell what they had originally looked like in terms of arms, legs, skull, all attached to one another. The ossuary contains the bones of an estimated 130,000 soldiers whose bodies were so torn apart by the relentless artillery fire during this 10-month battle that their remains were no longer impossible to identify. It was impossible to determine which portion of their remains belonged to which person. So what you had was a scattering of skulls here, arm bones there, and so forth. And so if you enter the ossuary, and you can, all you see are piles and piles of skulls, the bones of arms and legs, and so on. And this cemetery and ossuary are sort of emblematic of the two world wars that racked the world during the 20th century. The First World War, of which the Battle of Verdun is a part, lasted between 1914 and 1918, and it resulted in the deaths of between 9 million and 11 million military men. That is to say, the deaths of soldiers, sailors, and airmen. An estimated 6 to 13 million civilians also died, sometimes by direct enemy action, but often by the malnutrition and disease caused by the war's disruptions. For example, in Germany, food became so scarce that by 1916, it was common for civilians to subsist on turnips. And in Berlin, when horses that were carrying wagons and so on dropped dead in the city streets from fatigue and malnutrition, those horses were almost immediately cut up for their meat and consumed by humans. And these figures, by the way, the civilian dead, do not include those from the Spanish flu epidemic that swept the world in 1918. They're separate from that. The Second World War, fought between 1939 and 1945, was even worse. A total of between 70 and 85 million perished. That's about 3% of the world's population back then. This includes an estimated 21 to 25 million military deaths and between 50 and 55 million civilian deaths, so that more civilians died during the Second World War than did soldiers, sailors, and airmen. Famine and malnutrition once again accounted for many civilian deaths, but millions more resulted from direct enemy action, especially bombing campaigns. And the figure also includes the 6 million Jews killed during the Holocaust, as well as hundreds of thousands of other ethnic groups that were also killed by the Nazis. And World War I and World War II were sort of quintessential examples of the phenomenon of total war. And what we're going to be looking at today is this phenomenon of total war, and we'll be looking at it in its totality. We won't be looking at the First World War and the Second World War and so forth as distinct entities. What we want to have is a sense of total war in overall perspective. Let me share the screen with you. That's not going to work. Hang on. Okay. We'll try this again. Sometimes things don't work as well as you wish that they would. Okay. All right. Here are the terms for today's lecture. We'll be looking at total war and genocide. Here are the terms themselves. By the end of this presentation, you should understand, first, the definition of total war as used in this course. Secondly, the major elements of total war in terms of mobilizing society: nationalism, conscription, bureaucracy, industrialization, and propaganda. Third, some key examples of the application of violence across a broad spectrum of the enemy society. And finally, I want you to understand the basics of genocide, and particularly the Nazi Holocaust. Let's start with a definition of total war. There have been lots of definitions of total war over time. Many of these emphasize the blurring or elimination of the distinction between war against non-combatants and war against non-combatants, civilians. But these kinds of wars in which this distinction was erased go back to ancient times. You would have seen them during the 100 Years' War. And so an example or a definition based upon this would be hopelessly elastic and far too sweeping to be of any use. And so the definition we're going to use is as follows. First, the complete or near complete mobilization of society for war. And secondly, the application of violence across a broad spectrum of an enemy society. Okay. So let's start first with the mobilization of society, the first half of this. Okay. The first element that I want you to grasp is one that you've already seen a couple of times before, with the French Revolution and in the lecture that I gave specifically on the subject of nationalism. Nationalism is actually absolutely crucial because it generates the kind of buy-in from the overall population of a society that allows the people of those societies to willingly send their young men off to war, that willingly causes civilians to accept privation and rationing and other kinds of discomfort, some of them very severe discomforts, out of the belief that the war is one in which they have a stake. And because of a strong sense of identification between themselves and the nation state of which they are a part. The second element is mass mobilization of manpower, particularly in terms of conscription. By the latter part of the 19th century and going into the early 20th century, every great power in Europe, with the exception of Great Britain, adopted conscription as the model on which it generated military manpower. And it got this model from the Germans. After a major war between the French and the Prussians, which was a precursor German society to Germany itself. After this war in 1871, in which the Germans just bashed the French quite quickly and quite completely, the German system of mobilizing manpower became one in which other countries adopted because it was so obviously effective. And to give you an idea of what this system looked like, here is an example of how the German conscription system itself worked. First, at the age of 20, every young man had to go into the army for 2 years of active service, strictly speaking, 3 years if you were in the cavalry or the artillery, but we're just going to deal with infantry. So 2 years of active service at that age. Then you would go out of active duty and you would be in the first line of reserves. And these would be young men aged between 22 and 26. You weren't done with your military service then either, because between 26 and 37, you served in a second line of reservists called the Landwehr. And the soldiers in the photograph represent men of this age group serving in a Landwehr unit. And your service didn't end there either, because you ended up in the Landsturm, which was a third line of reservists who were available to be called up. These were men between 37 and 45. And depending upon the extent of the needs of the German army, and by extension, other European armies, any or all of these reserve groups could be called upon to augment, to supplement the active duty army. And so in 1914, when the First World War broke out, the German army was very quickly able to expand from about 800,000 men on active service to 3.5 million troops when you included the addition of the reserves and the Landwehr, and then later on the Landsturm units. Next, as unlikely as it may seem, you have bureaucracy, modern bureaucracy that comes out of large corporations. Large corporations had to be able to administer operations over tens of thousands of employees very often and over great distances, and they had to develop the ability to keep track of all the paperwork that was involved with that. The paperwork involved with just simply paying, making payments, paying salaries, paying retirement, but also making sure that you had records of orders that went out. If it was a railroad company, to the various trains, the various train stations, the various individuals who administer the trains and the train stations, and so forth, the invoices that went out to customers, and so forth. This required a vast bureaucracy. Well, so did military organizations. They required a vast bureaucracy in terms of getting soldiers from point A to point B, making sure that they got paid, making sure that they got fed, had proper uniforms, had weapons, had proper resupply, and so forth. And what bureaucracy does is it tremendously extends an administrative span of control. And so you don't ordinarily think of bureaucracy as having anything to do with war, but in fact, it has a whole lot to do with war. You simply could not function with a modern war without this level of organization. The next thing that enables total war in the modern sense, this complete or near complete mobilization of society for war, is industrialization. You'll recall that in ancient times, there were real limits to the amount of mobilization that either a Greek city-state or the Roman Republic or the Roman Empire could marshal for warfare, because between 97 and 97%, or sometimes even more, of the population had to be kept at home in order to feed the population. And that percentage of people had to be farmers to handle the agricultural sector. You only had a small segment that were available to be military specialists. Industrialization changed that. You still had a significant part of the population that was devoted to farming, but the population by this time was large enough that actually a majority of people in many countries now lived in cities. You had the phenomenon of what's called urbanization as people moved into the cities, and they moved into cities primarily to do the work of working in factories that did manufacturing on a very large scale. Industrialization begins. Historians usually pick about 1750 as the beginnings of industrialization, starts in Great Britain and then expands throughout Europe and then to the United States and other such countries, Canada, and so forth. And by the end of the 19th century, had stretched all the way to Japan. And again, this industrialization is based on mass manufacturing, which enabled you to supply these much larger armies with uniforms, weapons, ammunition, and hundreds of other items that were required to prosecute a modern war on a large scale. Then you also have the modern phenomenon of propaganda and dissent. And I call it a modern phenomenon. You've had propaganda around for a long time. The levee en masse during the French Revolution is an example of propaganda. The idea of requisitioning the entire French population, using those eloquent words about the young men will go into battle, married men will assist in this, children will do things, and old men will carry themselves into the market square to preach about the values of the revolution and the hatred of kings. This is a kind of propaganda too, but the propaganda that we're talking about here is actually it's an outgrowth of industrialization, because these very large corporations that emerged, in order to sell their products, they relied on modern advertising. And they learned what worked. They learned what pushed the buttons of customers to want to purchase their goods. And they also learned what worked on customers or on the population in terms of pushing their buttons, in terms of making them angry at the enemy, and anxious to get into war with an enemy that was demonized and that was viewed as a threat to the whole world. And so, if you look on the left, you see this American poster, and it could have easily been a British poster from some other country. Take a close look at it. Destroy this mad brute itself, enlist. And the Germans in this instance are represented as a club-wielding ape with a German Pickelhaube, which is a distinctively German kind of ceremonial helmet. That's bad enough in itself, but notice what the ape is carrying in its left arm. It has got a young woman, and the young woman's breasts are bare, and that's no accident. The implication is that this ape is carrying off this woman in order to rape her, and a traditional trope in the way in which societies have looked upon the role between men and women is the idea of men as being the protectors of women, and then women as representing the beautiful soul of a society, all that is good and virtuous about a society. And the idea of men protecting women from rape is very powerful, particularly when you take into account the rather dark idea that somehow a man's masculinity is on the line if he can't protect his women. This is a tremendous amount of stereotyping on both sides. But it's the kind of thing that really pushes people's buttons. And that was the operative point. They weren't trying to make some kind of subtle analysis of the actual relationship between men and women. They were trying to get, men really riled up and wanting to enlist to go off and fight, this quote unquote mad brute. And it worked. Alongside propaganda, what you wanted to do was to still the voices of those who would speak against the war effort. And even in the United States, where you have First Amendment rights of freedom of expression, these rights were curtailed during the First World War, sometimes informally, sometimes by the simple fact that getting up and speaking against the war, could get you a knuckle sandwich from somebody who was upset with what you were saying. Some people were killed outright by crowds who were upset with the fact that they dissented from the war. The fellow on the right is Eugene V. Debs. He was a candidate for president on a number of occasions. He was a socialist. This at a time when socialism was not yet a dirty word. When the war broke out, he spoke out against it. 1914, 1915, 1916, even the early part of 1917, the dominant political position within the United States was that the United States should not get involved in a foreign war in Europe. And Debs continued to believe that. But after April 1917, when the United States Congress decided to go to war on the basis of the President Woodrow Wilson's recommendation, all of a sudden that particular point of view was now out of bounds. And for saying the same thing after the United States went to war, Eugene V. Debs was found guilty of sedition for speaking out on this question and was put in jail for it. So much for freedom of expression. We'll stop there. We'll stop there for right here. What I want to do is give you a bit of a break, and then we'll pick up with the story on the other side. Okay. Bye-bye for now.